I don't care what he says. Just keep him away from the show floor until we've got real buyers here. The sales manager muttered under his breath, loud enough that half the showroom heard it. His words weren't coded in overt hatred, but their implication carried the unmistakable weight of quiet bias. Disguised behind faux professionalism and crisp suits, his sentiment rang louder than any slur could have. Certain people don't belong in luxury spaces unless they're cleaning them. It wasn't the first time Elijah Mercer had been dismissed before a single word left his lips, and unfortunately, he knew it wouldn't be the last. He had seen this particular breed of gatekeeping before, the kind that rarely makes headlines but shapes daily reality for countless black professionals. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in the world, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because corporate accountability starts with us refusing to stay silent. That morning had started like any other in Elijah's world. Efficient, focused, and quietly powerful. His tailored navy wool blazer fell perfectly over a pressed white shirt, and his cufflinks glinted softly beneath the showroom lighting. He wasn't trying to make a statement, but his very presence seemed to trigger discomfort in the same people who shook hands daily with men who looked nothing like him. Elijah Mercer wasn't there to browse. He wasn't there to test drive or fantasize. He was there for something far more impactful. A covert compliance audit authorized by Vanguard Automotive Holdings, the conglomerate that owned the dealership he'd just walked into. His title, Director of Operational Equity, granted him full authority to evaluate regional partners on metrics of bias, inclusion, and performance. But no badge or title had ever shielded him from first impressions, especially when those impressions were shaped by skin color and assumptions. From the moment he stepped onto the property, the scrutiny began. Elijah had parked his decade-old Honda Accord, deliberately chosen for this visit, between a Porsche and a Tesla. His entrance had been slow and intentional, eyes scanning the glass walls and polished marble floors as he noted security camera placements, employee interactions, and how quickly they responded to the white couple who walked in 2 minutes after him. The receptionist barely looked up when he approached. Instead of the usual, "Welcome in. How can we help you today?" he was met with silence and a sideways glance. Her fingers continued tapping across her phone, as if his presence was a minor disruption in a day she expected to go smoothly. He waited politely for acknowledgement that never came. Across the floor, Daniel Ward, the regional sales manager, stood with arms folded across his chest, whispering to a junior sales rep. His face held the pinched smile of someone trying not to be overt but failing spectacularly. Elijah heard it then. The whispered directive to keep him by the wall until we know he's legit. Ward's assumption wasn't just defensive. It was an operational failure in real time. Elijah jotted a mental note. He wouldn't need to provoke. He wouldn't need to argue. They were handing him everything on a silver platter, or, in this case, a brushed aluminum sales desk. Elijah wandered slowly toward the flagship vehicle stationed in the center of the showroom, a fully electric luxury coupe encased in velvet rope and bathed in spotlight. He made a few notes in his leather-bound planner, observing the carbon fiber detailing and wireless console integration, metrics he knew inside out thanks to years of consulting with automotive brands across Europe and Asia. But his posture, his stillness, his careful note-taking, became a point of suspicion. Nearby staff stared. Phones stopped ringing. Laughter from the finance desk went silent. The microaggressions were layered. Glances that lasted too long, smiles that never reached the eyes, and the overeager presence of a security guard who suddenly found reason to linger by the espresso machine. To anyone else, Elijah might have looked like a potential buyer, or maybe a consultant, sharp, curious, composed. But to Ward, he looked like something else entirely. A threat to their carefully curated clientele, to their assumptions about who could afford or deserved luxury. Eventually, Elijah approached the service desk, greeted by a forced smile from the same woman who had earlier refused to acknowledge him. He introduced himself calmly, mentioned that he had business with the management team and was hoping to speak with whoever oversaw operations. Before he could finish his sentence, Ward appeared, stepping between Elijah and the desk like a defensive lineman protecting his quarterback. "You looking to make a purchase?" Ward asked, folding his arms and wearing a smile that had long since outlived its sincerity. Elijah's voice remained neutral, practiced. He simply asked if they had time to discuss performance optimization strategies and customer experience data. He carried no air of superiority, no threat, just presence. That was enough to make them bristle. Ward waved toward the door. "You can wait outside until someone's available. We're a bit busy with clients who are here to buy today." No swearing, no yelling, just a weaponized smile and a dismissive gesture. In that moment, Elijah knew everything he needed to know. The people in that showroom didn't see a strategist. They didn't see a senior executive. They saw a black man with a notebook, which to them meant trouble. He gave Ward one final glance, not of anger, but of quiet acknowledgement. They had played their part, and now he would play his. As Elijah stepped outside into the cold autumn air, he pulled out his phone and opened a secure app used exclusively by Vanguard Automotive Holdings executives. A red dot blinked at the top of the screen. Covert audit, in progress. He pressed Submit Summary, then clicked the button labeled Activate Protocol 9. Back inside, Ward smirked and turned to Tommy, still chuckling. Some people really don't know their place. But what Ward didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man they just dismissed held the power to change everything about the dealership they believed they ran. Because the moment Elijah stepped outside, the countdown had begun. In 10 minutes, the showroom would never be the same again. The autumn breeze outside was sharp, but the cold Elijah Mercer felt had nothing to do with the temperature. It came from the kind of chill that only comes with being reminded, yet again, of how invisible you can become when you're not seen as fitting the mold. He stood on the polished sidewalk, just outside the massive glass facade of a dealership that cost millions to build. Inside, white clients sipped espresso. A young couple laughed with a salesman while configuring their lease terms on a convertible. Sales associates buzzed from one corner of the showroom to the other, laughing, pitching, shaking hands. It was business as usual for everyone else. Elijah, on the other hand, had just been publicly dismissed from that world without a raised voice, without profanity, without confrontation. That was what made it all so insidious. It was clean. The discrimination was sterilized, delivered through a professional smile, a gesture toward the door, and words like standard policy and appointment only. That's what made it harder to call out. That's what made it sting more. He'd encountered it before. But this time was different. This time, Elijah wasn't just another customer or unknown face. He was the hidden architect of the very audit that would now dismantle everything happening behind that showroom glass. He was the test, one the staff had just failed. He opened the secure Vanguard app on his phone and initiated the second phase of his evaluation. Behind its sleek interface were years of refined operational policy, accountability systems, and protocols designed not just to punish discriminatory behavior, but to root it out systemically. Elijah didn't believe in surface-level apologies or weak public statements. He believed in measurable, irreversible reform. Protocol 9 had one purpose: transformation through consequence. The moment he tapped the button, alerts began to ripple across the corporate chain of Vanguard Automotive Holdings. In less than 5 minutes, 2 vehicles pulled up discreetly in the parking lot. A matte black SUV and a silver sedan, both bearing the license tags of Vanguard Executive Services. From them stepped Janet Morrison, Vanguard's Director of HR Compliance, and David Chen, a civil rights attorney who had worked on more than 200 cases of workplace discrimination. Neither wore suits. They didn't need them. Their badges and digital clearances were all the uniform required. As they entered the dealership, Elijah followed silently behind, briefcase in hand. Inside, the atmosphere didn't change at first. Hanson still hovered near his desk, too proud to realize what was walking through the doors. Tommy was laughing with another rep, likely recalling their earlier tire kicker conversation. Sarah, the finance manager, stood midway through a leasing consult but paused when she caught a glimpse of Elijah walking back in, this time flanked by 2 people who clearly weren't here to browse. A few customers stopped their conversations to watch. Eyes followed the trio as they approached the central desk. The receptionist, who had earlier ignored Elijah, froze when she saw Janet place a corporate tablet on the counter and begin typing without speaking a word. This was no longer a casual visit. This was protocol in motion, and the shift was palpable. Every step taken now had the weight of corporate reform behind it. Elijah no longer needed to explain who he was or why he had come. The room, now growing noticeably quieter, began to understand. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. Something bigger was unfolding. Janet began silently scanning faces in the room. Her training allowed her to read micro-expressions, the flushed cheeks of guilt, the nervous shuffles of feet, the darting glances toward management offices. She could always tell who knew what had gone wrong before they ever opened their mouths. It was almost an art form. David Chen, meanwhile, began logging the layout of the space, observing who was interacting with whom, where the power dynamics were concentrated, and which employees made a visible effort to distance themselves from Hansen. The audit wasn't just about what had happened to Elijah, it was about uncovering what else was likely happening when no one was watching. In a side room, Janet requested footage from all showroom security cameras for the past 24 hours, citing immediate compliance investigation. One technician hesitated until Elijah displayed his executive credentials. That silence was telling. They were used to hierarchy, but not hierarchy walking in with brown skin and quiet authority. Across the showroom floor, Daniel Hansen was finally starting to sense that the situation had turned, and not in his favor. He approached, slow and unsure, trying to reassert the posture of someone still in control. But it was too late. He could feel the weight of judgment settling into the air around him like a fog. The customers noticed. The staff noticed. And worst of all, the ones with phones were starting to film. Phones were always the great equalizer. In an age of digital receipts, denials didn't stand a chance. Sarah, who had remained mostly silent during the morning's incident, leaned in slightly toward a coworker. Her whisper was almost too quiet to catch. "I think he's corporate." The realization was blooming now. Elijah wasn't a nobody. He wasn't a problem to be escorted out. He was someone who held power, not loud, not performative, but real. The kind of power that reshapes hierarchies and rewrites how companies do business. And Elijah wasn't here for revenge. He didn't need vindication. He had something else on his mind entirely: reform. He walked the floor now not as a visitor but as an authority. Not with arrogance, but with undeniable presence. He greeted a receptionist with a simple nod, glanced toward the glass office where Hansen had first smirked at him, made mental notes of who stepped up, who stayed silent, and who quietly walked away. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just 20 minutes earlier, he had been invisible. An obstacle, an annoyance, a man in a good suit driving the wrong car. Now, he was the reason every employee in that building would soon be called into emergency HR debriefings. He was the reason the regional manager would fly in tomorrow. He was the reason Vanguard's board would be presented with a full compliance breach report before the week was over. Elijah didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He had already spoken the loudest sentence of all. "You judged the wrong man." And in 10 more minutes, the showroom floor would understand just how much that judgment would cost them. The glass walls of the dealership had always served as a visual barrier, not just between the polished interior and the asphalt outside, but between two worlds, one of assumed power and the other of invisible judgment. But as Elijah Mercer walked back in, flanked by the quiet, serious presence of Vanguard's HR director and their legal advisor, that glass lost its power. The moment had shifted. The energy changed before a single word was said. It was in the way customers stopped mid-sentence, eyes darting toward the unexpected procession of corporate presence. It was in the stillness of the staff behind their desks, unsure whether to continue typing or pretend to be on the phone. It was in the subtle way conversations died off and glances turned into stares. People didn't know exactly what was happening, but they knew something had cracked. The man who had been told to wait outside just minutes earlier had returned with backup. It wasn't just any backup. It was the kind that carried consequence. The kind that had no uniforms, no name tags, and yet wore authority like a second skin. Elijah didn't need to say who he was. The air around him said it for him. Some customers, at first, assumed it was an investor walkthrough or maybe a surprise inspection. But then they saw the tension on the faces of the employees, the tight-lipped glances between managers, the barely concealed panic behind forced smiles. Then they saw Elijah. Not angry, not rattled, not theatrical. Simply walking with that unshakable calm of a man who had been underestimated too many times to count, and had long since stopped being surprised by it. Sarah, from finance, was the first to feel it in her chest. A slow, aching realization that the incident she had quietly witnessed earlier, the one she had rationalized as just Rick being Rick, might actually be something more serious. She had seen Elijah approach with professionalism, had heard the firm but respectful tone in his voice, had even considered intervening. But she hadn't, and now she watched the consequence of her silence unfold before her. Customers noticed. One man, seated with his wife near the front, leaned forward slightly in his leather chair. Another woman, looking at a silver SUV just minutes earlier, now clutched her handbag and moved slowly toward the edge of the room, phone in hand. It wasn't just interest anymore. It was witness, because what they were seeing was not normal. And they knew it. David Chun, the civil rights attorney who walked beside Elijah, was already scanning the room for potential allies. Not just staff but customers. Because the truth was, the most powerful statements in these moments didn't always come from those paid to speak, but from those who chose to. The murmurs began softly, not loud enough to be disruptive, but loud enough to spread. That's him. The guy they asked to leave. Wait, is he with corporate? Why's legal here? Did they really kick him out? Unreal. From behind a desk near the entrance, a younger staff member tried to return his attention to the glowing CRM on his screen, but his fingers hovered above the keyboard, unmoving. He'd overheard the earlier exchange too, the subtle put-downs, the mocking tone, the way Hansen had leaned in with that cocky smirk and treated Elijah like a street solicitor instead of a business partner. He had said nothing. Now, shame filled the silence he had left behind. The receptionist, who hadn't even lifted her eyes when Elijah first arrived, now stood stiffly, her voice cracking slightly as she asked if the team would like espresso or water. Janet declined without looking up, already pulling up employee conduct logs on her tablet. She didn't need caffeine. She needed answers. Rick Hansen was nowhere to be seen. Whether he was hiding in his office or pacing behind a door, it didn't matter. The crowd, slowly growing in number and unease, didn't need him present to start forming their own judgments. Customers whispered to each other now more openly. A young mother with a toddler in her arms adjusted the angle of her stroller so she could better hear what was being said. An older gentleman, who had long believed in pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, now shifted uncomfortably as he watched a black man in a suit being quietly trailed by two people who clearly held more authority than the entire floor team combined. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He began to speak with Janet at the center desk, requesting access to the employee policy binders, incident logs, and client interaction recordings. There was no dramatic monologue, no finger-pointing. But every movement, every tap of Janet's stylus, every reference David made to state-level compliance regulations, said one thing louder than any outburst could: this wasn't going away. And then came the phones. It started with just one, the woman by the silver SUV, recording quietly from her side. But then another phone was raised. And then another. Customers who had first come in to buy cars were now capturing history in real time. There were no raised voices, no violence, no security scuffles. But everyone knew they were watching something bigger than a bad customer service moment. They were watching accountability walk into the room. The young employee at the leasing desk opened his Instagram. Then he opened his camera. It was risky, sure, but he wanted to remember this moment. Not because he expected it to be erased, but because he hoped it wouldn't be. Because this was the moment the tide turned. The moment when whispered racism, so often protected by plausible deniability, was finally confronted by a presence too powerful to ignore and too calm to dismiss. Elijah hadn't come to make a scene, but the truth was the scene was making itself. And the room had chosen its cast. The crowd had become part of the story, not by what they said but by what they saw. and, finally, by what they chose to do with it. By the time Elijah Mercer reached the center of the showroom floor, the energy was unrecognizable from what it had been just 20 minutes prior. The glossy luxury cars were still there, rotating on their display platforms under soft halogen light. The espresso machines still hissed in the corner, and sales reps still held clipboards and wore Rolexes. But none of it had the same shine. The room had cracked. The presence of Janet Morrison, Vanguard's HR director, and David Chun, legal counsel with a reputation for turning quiet moments into court precedent, had altered the gravitational pull of the room. The staff, so used to gliding between prospects with confident smiles and rehearsed pitches, now walked with caution, unsure whether they were selling cars or standing on trial. And at the center of it all, like a still flame in the eye of a storm, stood Elijah, calm, dignified, composed. The man they'd told to wait outside now stood before them with the weight of corporate reform behind him. But he carried it without vengeance, without noise, and without the need to explain who he was. His silence alone had become the loudest voice in the room. As Janet typed briskly on her tablet, the company's internal compliance dashboard bloomed across her screen. Names, performance logs, complaint histories. She had already identified 3 red flags. All employees reporting to Daniel Hansen. All of them, according to past reviews, had received anonymous complaints tied to racial profiling, poor service interactions, and premature sales dismissals. Nothing actionable on its own. But now, in the context of Elijah's experience and the growing crowd of recording witnesses, the pattern wasn't just visible. It was undeniable. David Chun was no longer asking questions. He was taking inventory of posture, language, reactions. He had learned long ago that people revealed more in stillness than they ever did in statements. And the tension on the floor was speaking volumes. The showroom had effectively become a live investigation. Customers continued to linger. Some browsed with feigned interest just to stay within earshot. Others had stopped pretending entirely. The phones were out again. Some recording, others live-streaming. And while no one was shouting, everyone knew this wasn't just about one man being mistreated. This was about a system cracking open. People sensed history in the making, and no one wanted to look away. And then, like a ripple through still water, the air shifted again. From the glass hallway came a slow, reluctant shuffle of dress shoes against polished tile. Daniel Hansen had emerged from his office. His face was carefully arranged, the forced expression of a man attempting professionalism in the face of rising panic. His jaw was tight, his tie slightly crooked, his eyes darting for cues. He didn't walk toward Elijah, not directly. He circled slowly, adjusting the cuff of his shirt, pretending to glance at sales reports pinned on nearby columns. But he couldn't avoid the center. The orbit of attention had already pulled him in. Janet didn't look up from her tablet. She had seen this dance before. The choreography of managers trying to soften their presence, to rewrite timelines, to avoid the moment they knew was coming. But Elijah did look at him. Not with malice. Not even with triumph. Just with clarity. The way a man looks when he's had years to prepare for this exact moment. Daniel tried to speak. But before words could find shape, Elijah reached into his briefcase and withdrew a slim folder. Vanguard's authorized compliance audit form. He placed it quietly on the nearest desk. Within its leather binding were documents bearing Vanguard's corporate seal, Elijah's credentials as a certified regional compliance executive, and a formal notation. Unannounced cultural equity evaluation. Premier Auto, downtown branch. There it was. The reveal. But Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't turn toward the cameras. He didn't even smile. Because this wasn't a performance. It was policy. Daniel finally stepped forward. And though his voice was calm, his words couldn't disguise the weight pressing down behind his forced composure. But by now, the crowd no longer saw him as the authority. His posture had shifted from confidence to containment. His reputation, which had for years protected him like an invisible shield, had cracked in public view. And that, more than any verbal rebuke, was the true undoing. Elijah's only response was to slide a second document across the desk. the one containing the federal non-discrimination clauses embedded in Vanguard's dealer franchise agreements. Highlighted in orange, violation of cultural conduct and compliance standards may result in immediate termination of dealership management. The line hung there, glowing in digital ink. Sarah from finance saw it first. Her breath caught in her throat, because now it was clear this wasn't just a dressing down. It wasn't just bad press or an awkward moment that would fade after lunch. This was structural. This was official. This was a man being reminded, in front of customers, co-workers, and corporate executives, that his assumptions had not only humiliated someone with power, they had endangered the dealership's license itself. And that license had a number on it. One that Vanguard could deactivate with a single corporate vote. Outside the main entrance, more customers arrived. Some slowed as they approached the building, peering in at the crowd through the floor-to-ceiling windows. What they saw was a luxury dealership frozen in something very unluxurious. Accountability. Inside, Elijah's work continued. Quietly, methodically, he collected statements. Janet noted compliance infractions. David cross-referenced testimony with regional training records. The questions were no longer about whether discrimination had occurred. That part was clear. The only question that remained was how deep it went, and how long it had been ignored. Elijah, for his part, never raised his voice. He didn't need to say, "I told you so." He didn't need to prove his worth, his title, or his authority. He had already done that. Not just today, but over years of work, over hundreds of dealerships, through every meeting where people shook his hand while quietly questioning why someone like him had a seat at the table. Today, he wasn't asking for a seat. He was reminding them that he built the table. And now, with the weight of the Vanguard name behind him and a room full of witnesses around him, Elijah Mercer had only one job left: to ensure that the next black customer who walked through those showroom doors wouldn't have to carry his own seat just to be seen. When systems crumble, it never happens all at once. It starts with hairline cracks, a soft shift in energy, a single decision that unspools everything. And that unraveling, when captured in real time, feels both inevitable and cinematic. That's what the floor of Premier Auto felt like now. Not a showroom, but a stage where consequences had finally caught up. By this point, every employee on site had figured it out. The man who had once stood politely at the reception desk, quietly dismissed as a non-serious visitor, was not just another walk-in. He wasn't a customer. He was the storm that arrived dressed like a summer breeze. Elijah Mercer hadn't spoken in several minutes, yet he had everyone's full attention. He moved with the kind of restraint that demanded it. The leather briefcase in his hand had already revealed more than any confrontation ever could. He hadn't needed raised voices, grand declarations, or threats. He had something far more powerful, undeniable truth, and the legal infrastructure to carry it. And then came the moment that changed everything. It wasn't the footage from the cameras. It wasn't the screenshots of policy violations logged into the compliance tablet Janet now clutched like a courtroom gavel. It wasn't even the murmured apologies from junior staff realizing too late they should have stepped in. It was the badge. Elijah reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, the same pocket he'd subtly tapped earlier in the day while he stood outside in the cold, gathering the last details of a field report he never should have had to complete personally. The ID was small, elegant, and final. He placed it down gently on the customer service desk, in full view of the customers who had begun to circle subtly, pretending to admire car features while leaning ever closer. The words on the badge were crisp and unmistakable. Elijah Mercer, Executive Director, Regional Operations and Compliance. Vanguard Automotive Holdings. The air in the room went taut, a silence so heavy it could bend metal. To most, it was just a name and a title. But to every employee inside that dealership, it was something else entirely. It was revelation. It was proof that they hadn't just misjudged someone. They had disrespected the very person who could unravel them from the inside out. For Daniel Hansen, that moment felt like a sharp intake of oxygen after holding his breath for too long. Only this wasn't relief. It was the deep, suffocating breath you take before going under. He now understood. He hadn't just offended a guest. He hadn't just treated someone poorly. He had turned away the one person he should have been preparing for weeks in advance. The person whose presence signaled an operational audit. The one whose signature could cost him his title, his reputation, and the dealership's license. Customers had begun to whisper again. Not in confusion, in awe. One muttered that it was like watching the plot twist in a movie. Another whispered to her husband that she'd seen that name in a shareholder report just last quarter. Others watched with wide eyes as Elijah calmly opened his briefcase again, withdrawing several folded documents, each bearing Vanguard's distinctive crest and sealed with Compliance Division embossing. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. This was the moment power had shifted. Elijah didn't gloat. That was never his way. He spoke just once, low, deliberate, professional. But the weight behind his words wasn't in tone or volume. It was in history, in a lifetime of being second-guessed, prejudged, or dismissed for not looking like he belonged. For being well-spoken instead of respected. For being the one who had to be twice as good just to be seen as equal. And now, as the silence pressed in on all sides, he didn't speak as a victim. He spoke as a gatekeeper. Sarah from finance looked as if she might cry. Because in that moment, she wasn't just witnessing a workplace reckoning. She was remembering every time she hadn't said anything. Every time she'd watched Hansen pull this exact behavior with someone else. Every time she'd heard the words, "We like to keep the showroom clean," spoken about customers who didn't wear the right clothes or have the right accent or skin color. Tommy, the junior rep who had snickered earlier in the day, now stared at the floor. He was too junior to speak, too guilty to meet Elijah's gaze. As for Hansen, the mask had dropped. The confidence that had once coated every word, every smirk, every offhand comment had evaporated. There was no clever recovery, no rehearsed apology, just a man standing in the ruins of his own arrogance, facing the realization that he wasn't just in trouble. He was done. Because Elijah hadn't come for a confrontation. He had come for accountability, and he had brought receipts. In the document folder now fanned out on the customer desk were performance metrics, complaint summaries, incident timelines, and notes from 2 other recent site visits, all of which painted a clear and damning picture. Premier Auto had been under quiet observation for months. Elijah's visit wasn't spontaneous. It was the final test, and they had failed. Customers now stood openly, watching from behind rows of sedans and polished sports cars. Their phones no longer hidden. Some had already uploaded footage. Others were streaming live. No one dared intervene. They were witnessing a different kind of justice, one built not on outrage but on infrastructure. Outside, a delivery truck pulled into the lot with a fresh shipment of branded promotional materials. The driver walked in carrying boxes with the dealership's name across the side, only to freeze at the sight of the crowd gathered in complete stillness. Something had changed, and everyone felt it. Because when power finally speaks, not with noise but with precision, it doesn't just correct a wrong. It reminds people that systems can shift, that silence can have consequences, and that sometimes the person you dismissed is the very person holding your future in their hands. Elijah didn't need to fire anyone. That decision would be made by policy, by Vanguard's board, by the very systems Hansen had once believed protected him. Elijah's job was already done. He had walked into the building invisible. He would walk out unforgettable. Because today, the man they told to wait outside came back to remind them that dignity doesn't knock. It walks in. By 5 p.m., the polished, echoing floors of Premier Auto were no longer a showroom. They had become a quiet battlefield of reckoning. Gone were the sleek sales pitches and espresso-scented confidence. In their place stood something colder, more final, truth backed by policy. Command Center had formed. Janet Morrison, Vanguard's HR compliance director, moved like a surgeon through the building. Tablet in hand, she gathered statements without expression, dissecting stories long buried beneath false smiles and immaculate suits. Her questions were efficient, but her silence did most of the work. Every shift of body language told her what she needed to know. In a back office now functioning as a legal depot, David Chun reviewed customer statements. Each one was documented with meticulous care. The live-streamed videos circulating online only amplified what Elijah had already confirmed through months of quiet investigation. Sarah from finance had hesitated at first, but once she started, it poured out. She confessed to the culture she'd helped protect through inaction. She spoke about visual vetting, a term used behind closed doors that had never appeared in policy, but had shaped nearly every customer interaction. Rick Hansen, the dealership's now-suspended manager, taught them how to pre-qualify people with a glance. A gut check, he said, separated real clients from browsers. Tommy, younger and more visibly shaken, echoed her story. He admitted it had become second nature, assessing race, wardrobe, accent, even how confidently a person walked into the showroom. The system had been unspoken, but everyone had played their part. And Jimmy, the security guard who'd worked there the longest, delivered the final blow. He confirmed what Elijah had already seen in the footage, that he'd been told to monitor specific types of customers more closely, people who didn't look like they belonged. By 6 p.m., Premier Auto's website quietly updated. Gone were its polished slogans. In their place, a single quiet banner that read, "Under new management." Inside the building, the final staff meeting of the day gathered beneath harsh fluorescent light and hushed reflection. Elijah stood calmly before them, the same man they had once asked to wait outside. He did not gloat. He did not scold. He simply stood, tall, composed, a mirror to everything the dealership had failed to be. His message wasn't about retribution. It was about honesty and transformation. Sarah, who had taken the first step toward truth, was appointed interim manager. Her appointment wasn't symbolic. It was strategic, earned through reflection, courage, and the willingness to name what others denied. Jimmy was offered a chance to stay, conditional on full participation in Vanguard's racial equity training. His eyes watered slightly when he nodded. It wasn't relief. It was release. Tommy, on the other hand, was let go, not as punishment but as consequence. His role in upholding discriminatory behavior, even under influence, had crossed a threshold. Reform required standards. And Rick Hansen? His name was quietly added to Vanguard's HR blacklist, flagged for lifetime ineligibility across every Vanguard-owned dealership nationwide. No press release, no public shaming, just a single digital entry that closed the chapter with finality. As the staff filtered out in quiet contemplation, Elijah remained still. The sun had started to dip beyond the dealership's horizon, casting long shadows across the now-still showroom. Through the windows, the same sidewalk he had been dismissed to earlier in the day shimmered gold under the setting light. Elijah packed his binder. No fanfare, no exit speech. He simply nodded once to Sarah. Not as a boss, not as a superior, but as someone who believed she would do it differently, and walked out into the dusk, having turned a place of exclusion into a seedbed for reform. The transformation didn't go viral. It didn't need to. Premier Auto reopened exactly 21 days later with no ribbon cutting, no speeches, no streamers. Just a single full-page newspaper ad printed in black ink on white background. No logo, no flourish. We messed up, and we're changing. Here's how. And then change. Inside, the showroom was the same. But the people, the language, the structure, everything was different. Every employee, from receptionist to senior consultant, had undergone Vanguard's new cultural impact training. Not the standard 2-hour compliance video, but immersive role reversal, empathy-led sessions that tested how they saw, spoke to, and supported every customer. Weekly mystery shoppers of every background, ethnicity, age, and income level were rotated into the floor, evaluating how they were approached, or if they were approached at all. Every single sales contract, offer letter, and employment agreement was updated with a zero-tolerance clause for discrimination. Any confirmed incident, even indirect, immediate grounds for dismissal. The results spoke for themselves. Customer reviews shifted. Repeat clients returned, not because prices changed, but because the temperature had. The place no longer felt like a private club. Felt like a professional, welcoming business. Within 2 months, Premier Auto reported its highest quarterly customer satisfaction scores in 4 years. But it wasn't just about numbers. The industry was watching. Other dealerships, competitors, and peers took notice. Executives began inquiring, discreetly at first, about what Vanguard had implemented. It wasn't just policy, it was culture engineering. And so Vanguard gave it a name, the Mercer Protocol, a corporate-wide blueprint based on the systems, reform, and leadership principles that emerged from Elijah's experience at Premier Auto. It wasn't punitive, it was preventative. The Mercer Protocol included a surprise audits across all locations, a blind customer profiling test, public-facing service equity scores, a leadership evaluations tied to cultural performance. The message was clear. Bias wasn't just a legal risk, it was a strategic failure. 6 months after that fateful day, Elijah Mercer stood at the Auto Leadership Summit in Chicago, a packed auditorium of over 500 industry professionals. Behind him, on the screen, were 2 words in bold type: "Belonging builds business." He didn't speak long. He spoke about the moment he was told to wait outside, about the silence that followed, about how easy it would have been to turn around, let it go, say nothing. But he didn't, because change doesn't come from outrage. It comes from decision. Leadership, Elijah said, isn't about corner offices or press releases. It's about protecting the dignity of the person who walks through your doors, especially when no one important is watching. The room rose in applause, not because he was loud, but because he had been right. If you believe discrimination has no place in business or anywhere, hit that subscribe button, comment with your thoughts, and share this story. Because change starts when we refuse to stay silent.